Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of WheelHouse's IT web series. Today's episode is going to be all about hurricane season. So we appreciate you joining us today. We've got a very special guest with us today from the National Weather Center down here in Miami that's going to be preparing us and letting us know what we are going to see this hurricane season and give you some tips on how you can prepare and how you can prepare your business as well. Um, Before we get started, just a few reminders here. We encourage you to ask questions. All questions are moderated. They're not going to show in the general audience until we publish the Q&A. So if you put a question in the Q&A panel, please note that my colleague Rory will be the one approving those and adding them to the queue. Once we realize it is an appropriate question, we'll add those to the queue and everyone will be able to see that. We'd love to know where you're viewing from. So if you don't mind, drop us a line where you're viewing from and who you are. And at the end, we're actually going to be giving away some prizes. So and then finally, for those of you that want to share this podcast, this web episode with your colleagues, we're going to post it after it's done being recorded at wheelhouse.it.com/resources. A little bit about who we are and why we're giving you this presentation. We are WheelHouse IT. We are the largest managed IT service provider in South Florida in the Southeast. We support over 250 clients and we provide enterprise level IT to the small and mid-market businesses with over 50 passionate IT professionals. We have a major focus on layering security and compliance on top of our managed IT services, and our growth has been a true statement for our process, folks. We are a very well-respected company in the Southeast, and we continue to work with more and more companies in the Southeastern United States and across the country as a whole. Our goal is to let people focus on their business while we focus on their IT. If IT is not in your wheelhouse, don't reinvent it, folks. We're also recognized by a leader from many of the vendors that we work with, including Microsoft, and one of the few managed services providers that have 4 gold Microsoft competencies. A lot of what we'll be talking about after our special guest today goes through his hurricane preparedness checklist will be how you can leverage your IT systems for business continuity. Essentially, in the case of a disaster like a hurricane, how to ensure that your business is still up and running. And then finally, I'd like to mention that we are one of the few managed service providers, if only on the Inc. 500 list. As for today's roadmap, please, again, I remind you to ask questions along the way. We're going to get into the hurricane history of South Florida, hazards that hurricanes bring along with them, how to get and use forecast information for hurricanes, how to prepare for them, and how to continue to work in the event that we do have a storm come. And then at the end, we'll save it all for Q&A. And then finally, for those of you that are willing to stick it out to the end, we've got some special prizes or a special prize to give away at the end. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to our presenter. Please welcome Robert.
Okay, so again, my name is Robert Molleda, and I'm the Warning Coordination Meteorologist with the National Weather Service Miami Forecast Office. And we're, National Weather Service, of course, the name implies we are national. We are part of the federal government. We're National Weather Service is under the agency we'll call it NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. But we are also local. That's really one of the things that I emphasize is that we are national. Of course, we're part of the federal government, but we have 122 local offices. And each of those offices across the country provide forecasts and warnings, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for a specific geographic area, for the geographic area in which the office is in. So in other words, we're local forecasters, but we also live in the area in which we forecast. And we also provide additional services such as community outreach, events just like this one, to our service area. So let's go to the next slide and let me get a sense of how long the delay is here.
Robert, I do believe it's roughly a 10-second delay.
Right. Okay. No problem. Yeah. The next slide shows basically it's kind of like our hurricane history shown in a very simple way, I guess. It's a map that has a bunch of lines across it, and basically that shows all of the tracks of all the hurricanes in which the center of the storm has passed within 65 miles of South Florida. So that gives you a sense of the number of hurricanes going back to 1865, which have passed near or over us. So not all of those have been direct hits, but many of those were direct hits. So again, we're talking 155 years here. So it's a long period of time. But the total number is about 39 that have passed within 65 miles. So that's considered at the very least a pretty close approach, if not a direct hit. So it definitely means that we are a hurricane-prone area. So regardless of what the seasonal outlook is indicating, we have to remember that we are threatened, fairly often. Maybe not every year, but if you live here long enough, you're going to go through several threats, maybe even a couple of direct strikes. So if we go to the next slide, now we'll start that gets into the outlook, right? We start, the outlook was released back at the end of May, and we release it every year. So the outlook is calling for an above normal season. So in other words, what we're expecting overall throughout the hurricane season is for an above normal number of storms. So we're talking, the outlook calls for 13 to 19 named storms, of which 6 to 10 could become hurricanes. And of those 6 to 10, 3 to 6 could be major hurricanes. So again, this is an overall perspective. It's not an indication of what areas are more likely to be hit. It's not an indication of when or where hurricanes might strike this season. It's just a general overall indication of the level of activity we expect, really in the area from the coast of Africa all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to North America, Central America, the Caribbean Sea, and the Gulf of Mexico. So it's a very large area. So it's important to put that in perspective also. All right, now go to the next slide. We talk about some of the factors that are going into the expectation or the outlook which is calling for an above normal season. So we look at there's many. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead too much here. Actually, the names are first. So we'll talk about the names and then we'll talk about the factors. So these are the names of the tropical systems for this season, and we've already had 3. We're definitely running well ahead of schedule as far as number of storms, and where we normally are this time of year as far as number of storms. So normally we don't get the 3rd storm until like the beginning of August. So we're definitely running well ahead from that sense. However, that can be a little bit misleading. Just because we have a quick early start doesn't automatically mean that we're going to have a crazy busy rest of the season. Now, it may end up being that way, but there's not a direct one-to-one correlation. Sometimes you get an early start and then things get quiet afterwards, and you don't start picking up again until a peak of the season, which is August and September.
Hey, Robert.
So again, yeah.
I apologize for the interruption. Is there any truth to the fact that we've seen some news reports that you guys are possibly looking at starting hurricane season a month early officially, since the last 6 years we've had named storms the month prior to in May instead of June?
There's been no official talk of that. I mean, I've heard some of the chatter as well. It's nothing official that I would say, yes, this is, there's something that we're, considering. It's not unusual. And in fact, like you mentioned, we've seen it at least the last several years where we've had, a storm develop in April or May or even in April. But it's the season, which is June through November, is defined by the period in which 90% of all tropical systems form during that time frame. So, in other words, it's not 100%. I mean, we do realize that there could be it's not unusual to have outliers. I think we would probably need to have some kind of a established, a continued trend, or maybe even more storms forming earlier, before June 1 for us to consider a change.
Gotcha.
So I'm not anticipating any changes in the near future, but if the trend continues or maybe or amplifies or gets even more noticeable, then who knows? But at least for now, no, we're planning on keeping it the same for now.
Okay.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. And yeah, we have the next slide up, which is the factors. And like I was starting to say earlier, there's a lot of factors or a lot of things that we look at. So I'm not going to go through all of them because we could spend a good hour talking about that. And frankly, it can get kind of boring. It gets a little bit too deep in the weeds. But essentially, we look at things. We look at large scale global weather patterns and then how they correlate to future storm development later that year. So we look at kind of early year trends and then do a little bit of extrapolation or comparison to past years that have had similar conditions. And one of the things that we look at is the presence of either El Nino or La Nina. And El Nino, I'm sure you've heard of these terms, you've heard of these things. El Nino and La Nina are basically alternating temperature patterns in the tropical Pacific Ocean that occur naturally. About every 3 to 7 years, we alternate from the El Nino pattern to the La Nina pattern. So, but basically, El Nino pattern is the warm water pattern in the Pacific Ocean, and the La Nina pattern is the opposite. It's the cold water pattern in the Pacific Ocean. And these warming and cooling of the waters in the Pacific Ocean actually have an influence worldwide, not just in the Atlantic Ocean, not just in that Pacific Ocean, but the influence weather patterns globally. So when we have El Nino pattern in place, that tends to suppress hurricane activity in the Atlantic Ocean. When we have La Nina, it's the opposite. This year, we're starting out with neither. In other words, we're kind of in a neutral pattern. So we don't have something like El Nino to limit the number of storms. And there is about a 40 to 50% chance, based on current indications at least, that La Nina could emerge or could start by sometime during the hurricane season. And then if that were the case, that could further enhance or increase the chances of the more storms would form. We also look at things like the water temperatures, and their water temperatures are running warmer than normal, so that's certainly a factor. We think that the tropical waves that are going to be moving off the coast of Africa, it looks like there's a better chance that they might be more vigorous, which, those are kind of like the seedlings for storms to form. Once those tropical waves move off Africa and make it out into the tropical Atlantic, then that's when they start to acquire the energy, from the warm water and start to develop low pressure areas and start to, develop into a low pressure tropical cyclone. So the stronger they are, the better chance they have of developing into that, into a tropical system, a tropical storm or hurricane. So again, those are the general conditions that we feel will be in place for the most part throughout the year. And these are based on indications or trends we're seeing now, and again, making using some projections that of course go through the remainder of hurricane season. So so again, this is a good reminder, right? I talked about the outlook, but we really have no skill in forecasting where individual storms are going to form or where they're going to go weeks or months in advance. Our forecasting really is, we forecast the actual track of existing tropical systems out to 5 days. We can monitor potential development maybe a week or even 10 days. Once you get to the 7 to 10 day time frame, once you get past that, you're really stretching the limits of our skill. In fact, you're stretching it to the point where we really don't have much skill at all. So I can't tell you right now, for example, if someone were to ask me, is South Florida going to get hit by a storm in August or September? My answer will be, I don't know. Quite simply, I really don't know. It's that, getting down to that level of detail so far in advance is something that we just don't have the skill right now. So again, putting it in perspective, it could be, we could end up with an active season and not get a single storm threatening us, or we could get a storm threatening us, or we could have the outlook indicating low number of storms and we still get hit or we still get threatened. There's no, again, we have to prepare and be ready the same way every year, despite what the outlook indicates. There really isn't a lot of new. There's not really much new that we're rolling out this year. We've made some additions to our forecast products over the last few years, and those are pretty much going to stay the same for this year. One thing we are adding is we're adding an extra point to the forecast map. So when you see our familiar track and cone map, which you're seeing on the screen here, it has the forecast points of individual, at different time frames. So we go from 12 hours to 24 hours to 48 hours I'm sorry, 12 to 24 to 36 to 48, 72 hours, and then we go 96 to 120 hours. Those are what the points represent. We're adding an extra one this year. We're adding a 60-hour forecast point, which is the one that's circled in red. So between the 48 and 72, we're adding a 60-hour. So we're giving additional information. In other words, based on the same forecast, where we're just adding an extra level of detail to give people, a little bit more detail in that 2 to 3 day time frame when things start to ramp up pretty quickly as far as, community preparedness and level of certainty and all that kind of stuff. All right, so we can go to the next slide where we'll start talking about some of the hurricane hazards. I'll wait for that to pop up, and then we can. So basically, I can start talking before it comes up. The hurricane hazards essentially, where we know that hurricanes are made up of wind or any tropical system, but there's other hazards that we have to consider as well. It's not just about the wind. We also have to be mindful of the flooding threat, which the flooding can come in different forms. It can come in different ways. It can come from storm surge, as well as from rainfall flooding. So we have to remember that tropical storms and hurricanes are multi-hazard impact events. If you click again, you'll see the different. There'll be pictures of different, of the depictions of different hazards. So you'll see some wind-related damage, some flooding from both storm surge and rainfall, as well as a tornado. So these are the different hazards that are associated with these tropical storms and hurricanes, which can be contained in any part of the storm. So that's important to remember that it's not just about one thing. We have to keep in mind that these systems can bring different hazards in different parts of the storm. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So we're basically, we're going to expand on this topic here. So we know that the wind is important. The wind is what categorizes the storms. So depending on the wind speed, we have the different categories. We go from 1 to 5 once it reaches hurricane strength. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. So category 1 is winds of 74 to 95 miles an hour. Category 2 goes up to 110 miles an hour, and so forth. So obviously, as you go up on the scale, the level of potential damage and the strength of the wind, obviously, and the impact of the wind increases. So once you get really to category 3, that's where we start labeling them as major hurricanes. So categories 3, 4, and 5 are major hurricanes with the potential for devastating to catastrophic damage. But even category 1s and 2s, we don't want to downplay those, because those are still very high, very dangerous winds. But obviously, when you get to the higher levels, that's when you start going from dangerous winds to devastating and catastrophic impacts. Okay, we should go to the next slide now. So, again, so wind is important, and our building codes, especially here in South Florida, our building codes are designed to withstand really a major hurricane. So that's why our building code is one of the strongest, definitely the strongest in the state of Florida, and really one of the strongest in the entire country. So from a wind standpoint, again, you're in a well-built, fairly new, modern structure that's been updated and kept up, you should be fine. Now, there are other factors we have to consider. We have to consider also the threat of flooding, which is in many ways independent of the threat from the wind. So, for example, I referred to storm surge as being a serious thing that we have to consider, especially in coastal areas. So it's those flooding impacts they're often the ones that get us the most. That, so in other words, we may have a storm that from a wind standpoint is significant, but it's not a major deal, but the flooding becomes the big problem. And there are many, many examples of those. All right, as we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about storm surge specifically, and how that, and the importance of that as far as our preparation and, and its potential impact, in coastal areas like South Florida, or really any part of the country, any coastal location in the hurricane, in a hurricane-prone area. So the storm surge is a abnormal rise of the water that's generated by the wind of a storm that's making landfall. So we have a hurricane, for example, that's just offshore, but it's approaching the coast. maybe making landfall in 6 to 12 hours, let's say. The winds of the storm are basically blowing against that ocean surface, is causing the water levels to rise. So as that storm approaches the coast, the water levels, and it starts to feel that shallower water of the coastline, the water levels are basically going to be pushed up. They're going to get higher and higher. So you end up getting a very high tide, or what we call a storm tide. So the storm surge is the amount of water above the normal tide. And in a hurricane, that higher water level is not going to stop just right at the coast. It's going to have momentum. It's going to be pushing inland. So that water is going to be spreading inland, and in some areas it can spread inland quite a ways. We're talking several miles. Here in Southeast Florida, our geography is such, not just on the coast, but the bathymetry, or the water depth offshore, means that we don't have a lot of inland penetration necessarily in most areas of Southeast Florida, but we still can have some storm surge, again, within a mile or within a couple miles of the coast. We look at some examples of storm surge, recent examples in other parts of the state and country, which gives you an idea of the potential devastation of storm surge. So you look at these pictures from Hurricane Michael in the Florida Panhandle in 2018, and then Hurricane Ike in Texas in 2008. You can see that that damage there, where you can basically see almost look like just like the entire landscape is swept clean. That was actually from storm surge. The waters did that, not the wind. Yes, there was strong wind. There were strong winds here too, but it was the water, the storm surge, that really did all that major damage, all that catastrophic damage. So when we say run from the water, hide from the wind, what we're saying is, yes, our building codes are such that we can hide from the wind, even in a major hurricane. And again, assuming that you're in a modern, well-built structure, you're in all likelihood, you're going to be okay, as long as you're taking those necessary protective steps. But you can't hide from the water. The water gets just too deep, too powerful. So because of that, we have storm surge, we have evacuation zones along all different parts of the coastline that take into account storm surge models. In other words, models that we run on hypothetical storms to get a sense of, okay, what are the areas that are prone to storm surge flooding from storms of different categories, different speeds of motion, different directions, all that. In the slide here, I have Broward County. So I use Broward County as an example here. We have every county has its own different zones based on their individual threats. But for Broward County, basically it's the areas east of Federal Highway or US 1. Those are the areas they're designated as the areas that are most storm surge prone, and there's two zones within it. The zone A, the red one, is basically the beach, right, or the barrier island. That's the highest prone area. The next area is zone B, that goes from the intercoastal waterway inland, right, on the mainland, all the way over to Federal Highway or US 1. So if there's a hurricane threatening, the county officials will be the ones who then decide, okay, these are when to indicate an evacuation, or when to order an evacuation of any or both of those zones. So as far as hurricanes, again, and tropical systems in general, they are, they're complex. Like I said before, they're not just about one aspect of the storm. It's not just about the wind. It's not just about flooding either, although flooding is a big thing. And this can present messaging, communication challenges. So for example, we have a Category 1 storm out there, right? Let's say a Category 1 hurricane is threatening us. Okay, Category 1 hurricane force winds are still strong winds. They're not as strong or not as damaging as a Category 3, 4, or 5. However, Category 1 hurricane force winds, if you look at from the slide here, still caused a lot of deaths and a lot of damage. Because again, it's not just about the wind. Category 1 hurricanes can be prolific flood producers. Again, the flooding hazard doesn't always match up. In fact, frequently it does not match up with the wind. So just because you have a Category 1 wind threat doesn't mean you have a category or a lower category flood threat. It could be the exact opposite. A slow moving Category 1 will likely produce copious rainfall that's going to produce massive flooding. In some areas, the storm surge from a Category 1 could be devastating as well. Not so much in Southeast Florida, but more so in areas like the Gulf of Mexico, where they're much more prone to storm surge from even storms that are not at the higher end of the Saffir-Simpson scale. Okay, we go to the next slide. So we're basically just can talk about some of the messaging here and how we the information that we see when we're tracking storms, how we can use that information to help us prepare, to help us understand the threats properly, and to then make good preparations, good planning based on that understanding of the threats at that time. I'll go ahead and wait until I can see the slide. Again, there's a bit of a delay, so I apologize for that. Yeah, I just want to make sure I want to make sure I'm talking about the right slide here. I think I know what's coming up, but okay, yes, yeah. The next two slides are basically pictures of flooding from an event that wasn't even a named storm back in 2000. Some of you that were in South Florida back in 2000 may remember this event. It was a storm that was kind of in its pre-development stage, if you will, but it dumped like 18 inches of rain over really large parts of the area in a very short period of time. So, as a result, as you see from the pictures, a lot of our streets essentially turned into rivers or canals. And again, just to illustrate that the wind and the flood threat do not match. The Category 1 wind threat or a tropical storm force wind is not going to correlate to a lower level flood threat all the time. Sometimes you can have a very high flood threat despite the winds are not all that high. So when we look at the forecast cone, which is one of the most popular, actually it is the most popular forecast product that people see not only on the website but also on TV. It's good to understand what we're trying to show, what we're depicting when we show this track and cone map. So the cone, the points, of course, represent the location where the forecaster thinks the hurricane or tropical storm is going to be at a certain period in time. The cone that surrounds that forecast track, that's the area that represents the probable track of the center of the storm. So taking into account the average forecast errors of the last 5 years, because we don't have perfect forecasts. Sometimes we're pretty close. In fact, a lot of times we're pretty close, but our forecasts aren't going to be 100% perfect. There's going to be a little bit of error in all storms. In some storms, they might be a little bit more than a little bit. So the cone gives you an idea. Okay, based on our average forecast skill over the last 5 years, this is the area where the center of the storm, has a 2 in 3 chance of being at any point during that storm. So it takes your attention away from a specific forecast point, and it also should take your attention away from the fact that a storm is not just a point on a map. A storm covers a fairly large area. So the impacts from that storm will often occur not only inside the cone, but they'll also extend outside the cone. So that presents another messaging challenge as well. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about the cone and how the size of the cone has changed over the years and why the size of the cone changes. Essentially, the size of the cone changes because as our forecasts become better, in other words, as our accuracy improves, the cone, because it's a direct reflection of our accuracy, the cone gets smaller. So if you look at this map, this graphic here, which shows like a comparison of the size of the cone from 2005, which is the purple line, all the way to this year's cone, which is the one in red, you can see how the cone is smaller. But does that mean that the storms themselves are getting smaller? No. Storm sizes are unchanged. Every season we're gonna have large storms, we're gonna have small storms, and we're gonna have storms that are in between. But the cone never changes. The cone for a given year is the same size for every storm. So it's kind of a one size fits all. So again, we don't want to fixate on the cone as the only area that we need to be concerned about because the impacts can extend well outside the cone. So again, the cone tells us where the center of the storm is most likely to go, or most likely to be. And of course, that map also tells you the whether we're expecting it to be a tropical storm, a hurricane, or if it's an M, it's a major hurricane, category 3 or higher. So that's what it tells us. So the next slide is going to be what it doesn't tell us. So the forecast cone does not tell us where the impacts from all the hazards are going to be and how bad the impacts could be. It's just giving you an idea of where the storm may be, where it's more likely to be during the next 5 days. But it doesn't get really down into the specifics as far as how much rain, how much storm surge, how much wind we might get in our area. And really, at the end of the day, that's really what matters, right? That's what we focus on. That's what we prepare for, is what could the storm be doing, or what is the storm expected to do in my location. So it doesn't give any specific information on any of the other storm's hazards, the storm surge, flooding, rainfall, tornadoes, etc. And it doesn't give any information on the size of the storm or the extent of the impact area. Again, as I said before, the forecast cone is a one-size-fits-all. So that can be deceiving, especially if it's a really large, powerful storm, like, for example, Hurricane Dorian was last year. So in fact, when you get down to the warning part of the storm, so let's say we're about 24 to 48 hours away, that's really when the cone loses its significance the most. Why? Because the cone, as the storm gets closer to us, the cone gets smaller, it gets narrower. Why? Well, because as the storm gets closer, we're more certain as to where it's going to go. We can hone in more on the exact track of the storm, but the size of the storm doesn't change. So if you click on the slide, you should be able to see a circle that represents the radius of the tropical storm force winds that extend outside the cone. Again, this is a reminder that, the areas in red, they're under a hurricane warning, and those areas extend outside the cone. Just because the cone is not over a particular location, let's say we're using Southeast Florida as a reference here, just because the cone is no longer over Southeast Florida doesn't mean that we're no longer under a threat. Because of the size of the storm, the impacts in this example here extended well outside the cone. In fact, this example here is from Hurricane Irma back in 2017. So if you may remember that storm, if you were in South Florida at the time, we had at least Category 1 hurricane force winds across really most of South Florida. We had, and we even had some storm surge, not a devastating one, but we had some storm surge run along the beach. And that was from a storm in which the center of the storm was actually on the west coast of Florida, not on the east coast. So it was a large storm. So the impacts were felt over a large area that extended outside the cone, as you see in the example there. So there's other information, right? There's additional information that we can use to properly assess our threat level and then to take the correct appropriate actions. So if we go to the next slide, then we'll start talking about that, the additional information that's out there that can help, you make a better, more informed decision beyond just using the cone and track map. So what we do here is we use the actual storm information. So we take into account the size of the storm. We take into account how large it is, how far away from the storm the winds extend, as well as alternate scenarios. So in other words, when we're telling people what to prepare for, when we're telling people what could occur in your neighborhood, we're not assuming that the forecast that we have out there is going to be perfect, right? So, we're acquiring a lot of information, right? We acquire a lot of data. We're getting data from satellites, from planes, from radars, and then all this data goes into computer models. And these computer models then crank out a forecast, right? A forecast of where it thinks the storm is going to go. And there's different models out there. There are models that are produced by NOAA here in the United States. There are models that are international from the European Meteorological Center, United Kingdom Meteorological Center, the Canadian Meteorological Center. Different countries have different models which have slightly different physics involved. So when you look at the famous spaghetti maps, which a lot of us look at when you see the different lines out there showing where each model is taking the storm, there are situations where there can be a wide difference. There's one example here, it's pretty classic, where it's like the lines are splattered all over the place. That doesn't happen too often, but it does happen. So what do we do here? In other words, what is this telling you? Well, what it's telling us is that their computer models are not agreeing. In fact, if you click on the slide again, you should see another map pop up, and it's actually one that's it was from a recent hurricane, Hurricane Matthew, I believe, in 2016, where even though in general they were kind of showing more or less the same threat area, it's the details that matter, right? So there's a big difference between a storm moving over the east coast of Florida versus a storm center staying 100 miles offshore. You're going to feel something either way, but you may get brushed by a storm if it's 100 miles away, or you might get directly hit with getting the worst part of it. It goes right over you. So where exactly it goes makes a pretty big difference. So we can go and advance further to the next slide. So you can see that example where it kind of spreads out from the Bahamas. Some models took it over Florida. Some models kept it offshore. And the hurricane forecaster has to use all that information, examine those models forecasts, and then issue the official forecast based on what they deem to be the most likely scenario. So the forecast you see, that track cone map, that is the most likely scenario according to the forecaster. Now, does that mean that the most likely forecast is going to be 100% right? Well, we've already established the point that no, but it's what we feel is the most likely scenario, or at least something pretty close to that. So then we go to the next slide. So we have to consider not only the most likely forecast or the most likely scenario that the official forecast is depicting, but also what are the other alternate scenarios? Because there are alternate scenarios. It's not just one possible scenario. So we take all those into account, and then from those alternate scenarios, we trim out the outliers, the ones that are on the outer edges that we feel have a very, very low chance of occurring, but we consider the vast majority of those, and that's where we come up with what we call our reasonable worst case scenario. So so when we think about, okay, what are we planning for, right? In other words, we want to know about the timing of the winds, how much storm surge, how much rainfall, what is the threat to my community? We have to consider those alternate scenarios. So yeah, if you go, sorry about that. If you go to the next slide, then you should be able to try to give a brief description of what basically how we use that concept of applying different potential scenarios, that are at least scientifically possible, or to come up with a depiction of what we should be preparing for, assuming that a storm is not going to behave exactly as we forecast it to be. So yeah, I'll just wait till I see the slide. That way I can give a better description of exactly what we're talking about here. In the meantime, by the way, if you have any questions, and you can feel free to go ahead and ask them. But okay, yeah. So okay, yeah, the line's a little bit displaced here. I apologize. I think when I transferred the slide over, when I transferred it over to a different format, it shifted the line a little bit. If you press it again, you'll see it'll animate. You'll see these different lines spread out, and each of these orange and red lines that you'll see here are basically alternate scenarios. So the white line is the forecast track of the storm. So let's assume that big thick white line, that's the forecaster's most likely scenario.
Hey, Robert, unfortunately, it doesn't seem that the animation is working.
Okay, not a problem. But yeah, I think I kind of explained it. So basically, we filter out those extreme outliers on both sides, and we take and say, okay, let's say about maybe 80 or 90% of those alternate scenarios. We'll apply those, and based on all those scenarios, which one gives us the reasonable worst case scenario for any particular location? And that's what we depict in our threat and impact maps that accompany the cone map. Why? Because we want to give you a safety margin. We don't want to just say, hey, look, I'll give you the reasonable best case scenario and assume that that's going to happen every time. Sure, in a lot of cases, that's what ends up happening. But there are other cases where the reasonable worst case scenario is the one that actually ends up happening in your area. And if you're underprepared, well, that could not only threaten your business or your property, but that certainly can put your life at risk. So that's why we use the reasonable worst case scenario concept for safety purposes. So when we address the question of to what extent should preparations be made when a storm threatens, we use that concept. So I think if you click again on this map, you should be able to see a series of maps, a series of graphics of maps that show different colors, which depict this reasonable worst case scenario. So when you go to our website, weather.gov/Miami, that will actually, when we're in a situation where we're under a threat of a tropical storm or hurricane, we'll be producing these maps that accompany the forecast track and cone map that give you additional information. So we're giving you detailed threat and impact assessments that you can then use to make informed decisions. So the different colors correspond to different threat levels for each of the hazards. So we're assessing each hazard individually, from the wind to the storm surge to the rainfall threat to the tornado. So we're taking each one independently, and we're putting those levels on the map there. So again, this is providing information that the cone does not explicitly give you. Okay, we can go to the next slide. We're getting pretty close to the end here. So again, we're gonna continue along this concept here one more time. So another important piece of the puzzle that when we're preparing for a storm is, when will the effects of the storm begin to be felt? Okay, so what we call the time of arrival of tropical storm force winds. That's the guideline by which communities use as, okay, when the time that tropical storm force winds arrive, that's the time that all preparation should be completed, because tropical storm force winds are dangerous winds. The winds are already too strong for outdoor activities to be safely prepared, to be safely performed. So too often, there's a tendency to fixate on the exact landfall point in time. Sure, it's important to know that, but it's also maybe more important to know when will the impacts start being felt. When are we going to start to see those tropical storm force winds affecting our area? Because they can precede the landfall time by as much as 24 hours, by as much as 24 hours in most cases. So if you go to the next slide, we have graphics that, again, also accompany the track and cone map, the hurricane threat and impact maps that we've just seen, that actually give you an idea of when those winds could arrive. So we have two versions of this. We have the most likely arrival time, and we have the earliest reasonable arrival time. So the next slide will show examples of each one of those. So we'll start with the earliest reasonable time. So the earliest reasonable time is the time in which, when you see that line over your area, the line that shows the day and time, if your preparations are done by that time, there's a greater than 90% chance that you'll be done, that your preparations will be completed before the arrival of tropical storm force winds. So in other words, it's a very safe, conservative time to use. So if you have activities or preparation that needs a long time to be completed, that there's a lot of moving parts to it, and you have a low tolerance for risk, then this is the time you want to use. It identifies the time window that users at any one of those locations can safely assume that you'll be free from tropical storm force winds. Now, if you have some activities that maybe you can wait a little bit longer, you can kind of hold off until you're maybe a little bit more confident as to when the winds are going to arrive, then the other version of this is the most likely arrival time, which is the next graphic that you'll see here. So that most likely arrival time is the one that basically has a 50-50 chance of it starting, of the winds arriving before or after the time depicted on the map. So yes, you are taking a bit more of a chance. But again, so that's why you have to be smart as far as which one to use for what activities. I know for general community preparedness, for example, for evacuations, county officials use the earliest reasonable time because it takes a long time to move people. For individual activities, however, you may decide to go with the most likely arrival time, which again kind of gives you that 50-50 time. This could be something as simple as maybe moving lawn furniture. Let's say you have outdoor furniture outside, you want to move it inside. You can wait a little bit longer for that maybe. So something that takes only a few minutes as opposed to several hours. So oftentimes there could be as much of a 12-hour difference between these two times, between the earliest reasonable and the most likely time, especially when you're still a few days out. So it gives you a good idea of a time window by which we should be prepared. That's really the purpose of those maps. Again, using that same concept, using a concept of alternate scenarios, assuming that storms may behave differently from what we're forecasting. Now, I'm going to finish off with this, one of the last points here is, not every storm is going to give us several days or a week to track. In fact, of the 4 hurricanes that have made landfall in the United States as a Category 5, we only have 4 that have actually were Category 5 in the U.S. at landfall. All of those 4 were tropical storms 3 days before landfall. So 3 days before they made landfall as Category 5, they were tropical storms. They weren't even hurricanes yet. That tells you that they intensified rapidly and very close to the United States. And in fact, in 3 of these 4, they were very close to Florida. They're very close to home here in Southeast Florida. So again, that's why we need stresses the importance of being ready, not just assuming that every storm is going to give us that week to 10 days. No, many of them only give us a few days. So we have to have that plan in place already. We have to understand, what we're going to do, right? If and when a storm threatens or approaches, and sometimes that decision has to be made rapidly. So you definitely can't come up with a plan when a storm starts to form out there. That plan already has to be in place. It's the execution of the plan, right? That's what matters. And that's what following the storms, following, the forecast closely, especially when there's a lot of activity out there. It's very, very important. So, just a couple of takeaways before we wrap up here. We don't want to over rely on that exact forecast track, right? That's why we talk about alternate scenarios and reasonable worst case scenarios and things like that. Every storm needs to be taken seriously, just from the Category 1s to the Category 5s and even the tropical storms. I think we have one more slide here. This should be the one right before the concluding slide. So really, it's about, again, it's, when you think about, things that could interrupt business, it's not just the wind. Yes, the wind's going to knock out power. And of course, we make contingencies and plans for that. But if you're in a flood-prone area, if you're in an area that's prone to flooding, not only from storm surge but from rainfall, flooding can be a major disruptor as well. Not only can it, lead to business disruptions, it can prevent people from getting to where they need to go. It can strand people or isolate communities, especially if it's a very, very, if it's just a massive rainfall event, which we certainly can get here in South Florida. So every storm is different. Hurricanes bring a variety of threats, so we can't assume that a storm that's out there right now is going to be similar to the one that we saw 2-3 years ago. It could be totally different. It can only a few miles difference in the forecast track can make all the difference in the world between us getting a near miss and us getting hit directly by a major hurricane. So again, don't assume that a storm is going to behave similar to one that occurred in the past that you're familiar with. You have to take every storm on its individual characteristics. All right, that wraps up the slides. So I'll be more than happy if we have any time to take any comments or questions.
Sure, Robert, thank you so much for all that information. It was absolutely great. If you don't mind, we're just going to run through a few more slides just so we can educate our viewers on how to take advantage of the information you just provided from an IT standpoint, how to prepare their business, and then we'll answer questions at the end. So folks, we really appreciate you hanging in there with us, and I hope that you were able to educate yourself on how to better prepare for a storm and how to leverage the information that you were provided in order to help make better decisions for your business. Obviously, when there's a storm coming, as business owners, you need to kind of make decisions. Okay, what are we doing to prepare? When are we going to have people work from home? And how do we move forward through this storm? Well, when you look from an IT standpoint, there are two terms that you're going to hear very often in the IT world, and that's disaster recovery and business continuity. Now, I've defined what those two things are here on the screen, but essentially disaster recovery is how you're going to recover from a disaster, as in you send everybody home, you shut everything down, and then where are you able to recover from that disaster? How far in the past did you lose your information? Business continuity is actually the process of being able to continue business through that disaster, so never being down. For those of you that are local to South Florida and only do business in South Florida, a DR strategy may benefit you because you're not going to have to worry about dealing with people outside of the state of Florida. But for those of you that are similar to us at WheelHouse IT, we focus on business continuity because although we are headquartered down here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, our clientele is across the nation. And I've been through this scenario before, folks. When you have a client in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Los Angeles, California, the first time a hurricane comes through, they're very sympathetic. After that, they still need to do business even though you're going through a storm. So we look at promoting business continuity, and there are several ways that you can leverage a lot of Wheelhouse's platform just for things just like that. Now, I know what you're thinking. A lot of you have probably put in place the ability to work remotely ever since the pandemic hit. Now, most of you have probably done it at least one of two ways. The first one is what's called a VPN, or a virtual private network. A VPN is essentially a secure connection, and we can show you here with this diagram, back to your corporate network. So it is leveraging a secure connection over the internet to connect to your private network, which is your very secure network, which is within the walls of your office for the most of you. The other one is remote desktop services. RDS is a Microsoft offering that essentially gives you a quote unquote desktop that is being served up by a server. The way that this works is there's a server that's connected to a desktop, and that server serves up an image to someone connecting over the internet. It is not a full Windows 10 desktop. It's actually not even a Windows 10 desktop. It is a Windows server. And again, you have to essentially remotely connect back into your home office to use these services. Now, as Robert was just kind enough to tell us, there are a lot of damages that happen from these storms, and they happen quite often. Here are a couple examples that you can see up here on the screen. On the left, we have an office building in the Brickell area of downtown Miami that was affected by Hurricane Wilma. On the right, you can see flooding in the Brickell area as well. So you have physical damage, you have flooding, and then just ask the folks in New York, that's an image from Hurricane Sandy of all of lower Manhattan without power. And if I remember correctly, that was multiple weeks that they were without power. So don't assume that you're only going to be out of business just for the duration of the actual disaster. These damages are long lasting. I mean, think about a data center in this first building. Chances are it's not going to be fully functional if you lose power. I mean, here, we'll check our next slide, right? So if you look on the left side, that is the diagram for the remote desktop service. On the right, that is the diagram for using a VPN. These are both scenarios that you probably have installed since the COVID-19 pandemic to allow your users to work remotely. Well, what happens when a hurricane comes through? Here we go. There's our storm coming through right there. Well, the first thing that happens is you're probably going to lose internet, right? Boom. Internet goes out. There goes your internet connection. You're not going to be able to connect back to your office because there's no internet. Now I know what you're thinking. All right, Todd, maybe we'll just throw up a couple hotspots. We'll use our cell phones, whatever it is. Well, what happens when you lose power? All the devices that you're remoting into are not going to work because there's no electricity for them. So now you're looking at backup generators. Now, in both of these scenarios, when you look at disaster recovery, everything in IT is about replication. So with both of these diagrams, you're also going to have a secondary set or a secondary data center elsewhere in the country. You don't want to have it in Florida because Florida is already being impacted and you live in Florida. So you're going to be paying for more real estate, so to say, up in the Carolinas, somewhere in the middle of the country, and it's just going to double your cost. Now, the easiest way to fix that is by moving everything to a central location. So we're going to go ahead and take that private network. Now, we're going to take that private network and we are going to move it off of from your office up into the Windows cloud. And you can see our awesome animation there. But by moving where your network is centralized out of, it gives you a different location to where you're connecting. Now, when we look at using the Windows cloud and the Windows virtual desktop, our centralized network is now listed in the cloud. It is no longer in your physical office. So no matter where you are, whether you're working from home, whether you're working from the corporate office, or if you're working from a Starbucks, you are able to connect to your corporate network just as safely and securely as if you were in that home office. We bring in the scenario of a disaster like a hurricane. If you lose your physical office, if you lose power, if you lose internet, no matter what, you can send your workers home, and realistically, they can actually work off of almost any device in any location and get the same experience. Now, the reason that we put this slide up here is you can see we have PCs and phones right next to each other, and you can see how that experience is the same whether someone is using a full-on PC or whether you're using their phone. Now, realistically, we're telling this to you as a disaster recovery / business continuity solution, but this is a phenomenal solution to have all the time with your company, because no matter what happens, your workers can open their phone, can open their tablet, can open their PC and access the corporate information as safely and securely as if they were in your corporate office. For those of you that are still on the fence, whether or not you're going to even go back to the offices full time, this is absolutely something that you should consider. And for those of you that are going to go back to the office, but also have a lot of road warriors, this is a perfect solution for you. We did want to dig into this solution a little bit further to share the experience with you. Unfortunately, we want to be mindful of time and make sure we have time for your questions. So if you are interested in learning more, please reach out to us here at WheelHouse IT, and we would be extremely happy to do a personalized demo for you and show you exactly how you can take advantage of Windows Virtual Desktop. Before we get going here at the beginning of the presentation, I promised you guys we'd be giving some stuff away. Rory, I'm not sure if you want to go ahead and do the giveaway.
Yeah, so what we'll do is we'll actually jump in and pull a random attendee out of our list, and then we'll contact that attendee at the end after we wrap up here, and give them our hurricane survival guide is what we're going to call it. We do want to thank Robert from the National Weather Service and the Hurricane Center down here in Miami. Robert, we greatly appreciate your time and what you guys do to keep all of us here in South Florida and across any of the coastlines safe with the storms that come through. If anybody has any questions, comments, concerns, you want to reach out, our contact information is on the screen, and you can also watch a recording or share this with your friends by visiting wheelhouseit.com/resources. Todd, I thank you for moderating. Robert, I thank you for doing your part in keeping us safe, and we thank you guys for tuning in. And until next time, we'll see you on the next WheelHouse IT web series.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.